Wang Yangming's school of mind philosophy is the only one in Japan, and it totally makes sense when you think about it. Why? Well, Chinese Zen Buddhism made its way to Japan a long time ago, and Zen Buddhism has been a big deal in Japanese Buddhism. This kind of thinking got the Japanese ready to embrace Wang Yangming's mind teaching, so it's a natural evolution. And hey, Japanese culture also has this whole willpower thing that's totally unrelated to Chinese Confucian culture. It's all about primitive religion and believing in the gods. Even the whole Bushido concept is a leftover from Japan's primitive religion, making it a seriously unique civilization. Huntington wrote this book called The Clash of Civilizations, where he sorted all the world's civilizations into 8 big groups, and Japan ended up in a group all by itself. I kept thinking about whether Huntington was right or not, and in the end, I think he was. You can say Japan is a part of Chinese Confucian culture, but there are a lot of differences. It's okay to put South Korea in the Chinese Confucian cultural circle, but Japan just doesn't fit in completely. It's a pretty strange country. Japan started picking up stuff from Chinese culture way back in 300 AD, like Confucianism and Buddhism, but for some reason, they just couldn't wrap their heads around Taoism. I was scratching my head, thinking they should be soaking up all aspects of Chinese culture, since the main deal in Chinese thought and culture is a mix of Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism. So, why couldn't they get with the Taoism program? Then, it hit me in a weird and totally random way. In 2008, I hopped on a plane to Japan for the first time. As we flew over Japan, it was a clear day, and I peered out the window and got a good look at the whole shebang. It looked like a bug chilling on the surface of the sea, and I knew it was sitting on a seismic belt. That's when it clicked for me why they couldn't get down with Taoism. Taoism tells us to take a step back and see the big picture, but where can they step back to? Only back into the ocean. The deep wisdom of Taoism really needs a big shot country, for real. So, their tough living situation doesn't leave them with many options. In this tough environment, Japan needs 2 kinds of thinking, Confucianism and Buddhism. Confucianism teaches the importance of taking responsibility within the community, while Buddhism encourages transcending life and death. Because they're always facing the reality of death, the Japanese admire the cherry blossom, their national flower. Why? It blooms brightly for a short time, then fades quickly, symbolizing a magnificent death, a reflection of the Japanese spirit. So, they're not afraid of death, as long as they go out in a dignified and splendid way. There are only a few nations in the world that are the least afraid of death, and Japan is one of them. You don't want to mess with them. In the end, the United States had to drop 2 atomic bombs, or else how many American soldiers would have died on Japanese soil? They fought for every inch of land, and if you had to defeat them and enter Japan's mainland, how many people would have died? 2 atomic bombs were dropped. One of the most scared of dying ethnic groups in the world, the Chinese. Why are Chinese folks so afraid of kicking the bucket? Why do they prefer to cling to life rather than bite the dust? It's all about their attachments. The Chinese culture is deeply influenced by Confucian traditions, and they hold on to their relationships. Even though they might seem to have a Buddhist attitude of letting go, that's not really the case. When faced with the threat of death, what's the strongest feeling for Chinese people? I don't want to go. Why? Because there are still people in this world who care about them. If there were no connections, if you didn't care about anyone and no one cared about you, then us Chinese folks wouldn't be scared of death. The reason we cling to this world is because of our connections. So, there was this college kid who took my philosophy class a long time ago. During a break, he goes, "Hey, Professor Wang, can you tell me what the meaning of life is?" I'm like, whoa, that's too deep, man. can't really answer that. You gotta be more specific, like, what's the meaning of life for Europeans? Or, what's the meaning of life for Arabs? Or, what's the meaning of life for Chinese folks? They're all different, you know? Then he goes, all right, I wanna know the meaning of life for Chinese people. And I just blurted out, attachment. He just couldn't get it at first, but I told him, you'll get it eventually. When you're facing death, you don't want to go. Why? Because of the attachments, right? That's the meaning of life for us Chinese, that's why we're a nation that's afraid of death. And it's okay to be afraid of death, isn't it? So, what shapes the meaning of life for us Chinese? Confucianism. Figuring out the meaning of life isn't like solving a math problem. No matter how tough the math problem is, even if you're not the sharpest tool in the shed, I could help you crack it in 3 months. Now, let me ask you this, where do you find the purpose of your existence? This is a question that you can't figure out even if you lock yourself away for 3 years, and you can't really experience it firsthand. Our understanding of life has already been influenced by Confucianism. That's why that Chinese saying is spot on. If heaven had not produced Confucius, then we would be in darkness through all time. Zhongni is the given name of Confucius, and his teachings have set the tone for what life means to us Chinese folks. It's all about family love and the sense of duty that comes with it. That's why we still hold on to our Chinese roots, and Confucius spirit still resonates within us. Some might argue that we're living in a modern, globalized world, so why bother with Confucius? But I'll tell you, you've got it all wrong. Confucius' influence is still very much alive within you. Our folks born in the 80s and 90s, while growing up, used to think of themselves as citizens of the world because they were always open to studying abroad. When you tell them they are Chinese, they initially think it's just about race. But later, they come to realize that being Chinese is more about culture. If you grow up in a Chinese-speaking environment and Chinese is your first language, you naturally absorb the Chinese way of thinking, emotions, and life attitudes. These are rooted in Confucianism, so they quickly come to identify as Chinese. After a short time abroad, they suddenly realize they are truly Chinese, and this experience is what we call culture shock. So, one day when my son was overseas, he suddenly called me and said, "Dad, my daughter is born. My daughter is born." He told me, and it hit me that I had been promoted, I became a grandfather. Then he said, when my daughter was born, I felt something deep in my heart. I know that my main job in life is to make sure my daughter grows up healthy and has a bright and happy future. I replied, good. You're still Chinese. I can't tell you the whole story due to time constraints, but it all comes back to the foundation and core of Chinese culture, which is Confucianism. Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism, the 3 philosophies. Among them, Confucianism is always the foundation. Although we may appreciate the Buddhist teachings that help us to be open-minded, and the Taoist teachings that help us to let go, we are still Confucianists, because taking on responsibilities is ingrained in our subconscious. The Chinese nation is the most caring about the next generation. This nation is so healthy, why? Because caring for the next generation is caring for the future, and striving for the next generation is striving for the future. This nation must be hardworking and courageous. Indians are also abundant in cheap labor as China, but there is a difference. They have a different purpose in work, as they think about the afterlife, while the Chinese think about the next generation. Even if I see no hope for wealth and honor in this lifetime, I still have to work hard. We recently hired this hourly worker at our place. She's almost 60 and works for 4 different households every day. I told him, you should think about retiring soon. You've made some money, not rich, but do you have enough to build a house? She said yes. I suggested she should stop working, but she said he couldn't. She has 2 sons, the older one is already married, and the younger one is still in college. He'll need to get married and have kids in the future, so how can she stop working? When I heard her say this, it really touched me. Later, I realized that I'm just like her. We're all the same. This is Chinese culture. It's healthy because our people always have faith in the future and keep striving for it. The reason for this faith lies in both Confucianism and Taoism. Why? Taoism tells us, the opposite drives the movement of Tao. Even in the darkest times, we Chinese never lose faith in the future because the darkness will pass, and the dawn is just ahead, all because the opposite drives the movement of Tao, which is truly remarkable. We just discussed that the core and foundation of Chinese culture is Confucianism. The meaning of life for Chinese people is bestowed by Confucianism. Therefore, the questions regarding life's meaning cannot be solved by an individual from any other ethnic group. They are born into this cultural world, immersed in the native language of this ethnic group, and unknowingly acquire the thoughts, emotions, and attitudes towards life of this ethnic group. This is unquestionable. Nowadays, we're always dealing with the West. We've got more than 100 years of modern history, and it's clear that China's modern history is all about learning from the West. How much have we learned? Well, we've gone as far as changing our own curriculum system. Our basic and higher education systems are pretty much westernized. At the end of the day, westernization is just that. The so-called westernization, firstly, involves the adoption of Western technology and the introduction of Western capitalist production relations, known as market economy, which entails conducting economic activities in accordance with the logic of capital. However, all of this does not fundamentally transform us into Westerners. The next thing we gotta figure out is how to rebuild our spiritual home, right? I mean, what was big question we were talking about? Back in the day, Westerners used to snatch people out of their families and get them all tied up in groups throughout the Christian era. So what happens when those religious groups start falling? It's like, everyone for himself in modern society, you know? Even in Chinese families, things are falling apart, and we gotta acknowledge that. Sure, there is a lot of longing for the good old days and a need to connect with roots, but let's face it, we've moved beyond just the family unit. Now, is there any group out there willing to take in these individuals who've broken away from their families? Nope, not really. Back in the day, during Mao Zedong's era, the big deal was getting into the CPC. Like, it was super important to be part of the party. So there's this person who spends years trying to join the CPC, but he can't get approved by the party branch in their unit. So what's left for him? He has got no other options. Then, he gets sick, really sick, and is lying on his deathbed. The cadres in his unit hold a meeting and finally approves his membership. They tell the person in their deathbed, "Hey, congrats, you're officially a member of the CPC now." And he leaves this world with a smile upon hearing the news. What if we stretch this period of history out? Imagine integrating family connections into political groups for a significant amount of time, only to dissolve these groups. This would naturally lead to a more individualistic society. But let's face it, the era of political groups can't go on forever. Politics is more about belief than faith, and the communist ideology does not address the ultimate issues. So, what's the deal with China today? The family unit has diminished, yet individuals aren't truly independent. So, what kind of society have we become? It's like a society of acquaintances, if you ask me. In the past, we relied on the support of our families. Now that the family structure has diminished, what do we rely on? Former classmates, former colleagues, former friends. However, In the current societal condition, this principle has not been firmly established. As described by Liang Shuming, died 1988, it is characterized by haphazard rule of law, tension, thinking to take shortcuts and get away, and collective unease. This is the state of society today. This is why I chose the topic for my lecture yesterday. Why is there a lack of rule of law? Where is the rule of law? In reality, it has not been firmly established, order is still not in place, and everyone harbors their own sense of luck, resulting in overall societal unease. In the 1930s, Liang Shuming described the state of Chinese society at that time with 16 characters, which are still appropriate in describing the situation today. It is still accurate. We are a restless nation, an anxious nation. This is the problem we are facing. So where is the way out? I have always advocated for the modernization of Confucianism. The Chinese people cannot and will not abandon the roots of our spiritual foundation. Can you really just give it up if you wanted to? No way. People have serious doubts about whether Confucian teachings can serve as a spiritual foundation in today's China. Why the doubts? The fact of the matter is, it's not just the breakdown of traditional family values, even small families are at risk of falling apart. When parents and children end up in court fighting over property, or when siblings sue each other, what's left of the family? In such a scenario, are you still going to talk to me about bringing back Confucianism in modern times? Of course, it has to be a new and updated form of Confucianism.